that's how we're gonna do it this year. So when you come to lab on Tuesday, whatever day your lab is, we'll have your exams there. You can take a look at them. You can ask me questions, obviously. I would recommend you look at your exam because there could have been an addition error or something was missed. That happens. We want you to get the grade that you deserve. And so if you see something, make sure you bring it up. Also, if you thought you got an answer right and you learned that you got it wrong, you're not sure why, this is a great learning opportunity for you to try to figure that out. Dr. Dean has told me to let you know that whatever questions come from the exam, to let him know, because that was all his content, and he can work through whatever it was with you. Okay. Keep in mind that although we're going to move from plants to animals today, I got a very fancy slide to reiterate that. It doesn't mean you should forget about plants. First off, the next midterm will include some of Dr. Dean's section. So you'll have questions on the next midterm about plants, so don't forget that stuff. The final exam will also have portions of it that are from the first half of the class, so you can't forget about those things. And finally, the best reason to not forget about plants is because you shouldn't. If you want to be a biologist or anything to do with science, plants are super important. So let's not forget about all the great things you learned from Dr. Dean about plants and all of their amazing characteristics and their diversity. Okay. So does anyone have any questions about sort of how we're going to run the show here for the rest of the quarter? People in the back row too. Okay. Yeah, I wear glasses sometimes. Anybody have any questions about the logistics of everything? Anything like that? Obviously, yeah.
Do we have to memorize a lot of pictures and that stuff?
Yes. I don't know. There's going to be things you have to remember. Yeah. As we go through, though, I'll talk about what's really important to think about and what's this is periphery information that might come. You probably already heard that this is a tough course, right? So it's good to prepare. Any other questions? Okay. All right, I think that was all the things I had to talk about before we got started. We're going to do this transition. It's impossible to make this work. So let's think about plants and animals together. These are ones that look like plants. So we've got lots of animals that look like plants. Think about the relationship between plants and animals, how important that is. Right? Sharing an ecosystem potentially, one eats the other potentially. There's lots of things that link plants and animals together. The thing that's going to link plants and animals together in this particular course is our style of how we're going to deliver the information. Essentially, this is about diversity, okay, and evolution. This section of the course is all about animal diversity. Okay, so think about these three animals on the board here, these three species, how very different they are. Okay? In the plant section, you would learn about all these different plant groups, right? All these different groups, what similarities they had to one another, what differences they had, and what tied them together from an evolutionary standpoint, right? Things that evolved through the evolution of plants to where you ended off last class. We're going to do the same thing here, but we're going to talk about animals. We're going to talk about evolutionary changes in animals. So what were the first animals? How do we go to what we have today? What are the underlying sort of relationships between all the different animals? And we're going to talk about this general diversity that we see. It's a beautiful, amazing thing, just how many different animals there are. So what's this one? I don't want the species name, but what animal group is that? This is where I encourage interaction. So make sure you ask questions, or if you want to put your hand up or talk about something. I always want this to be a two-way situation. So anybody know what these are? Yeah.
I believe those are two words.
Nope, not a tube worm. Kind of looks like them. Anybody else? Yeah.
Is it a sea slug?
Say again?
I know the animal, the sea slug.
It's a sea slug. Yeah, that's right. So that's a group of snails that live in the ocean that don't have shells, right? So it's one of my favorite groups of animals. They're called nudibranchs, means naked gill. So we'll get into that later. But this is one of the most beautiful groups of animals out there that most people don't know anything about. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about those a little bit. Anybody know what this is?
Mammals.
What? I thought I heard llama, but, okay. Well, we all know the pandas, right? So another really cool animal, very different from the nudibranch or sea slug. And, all right, good. I took this picture. Can you believe it? Awesome. I had a really good zoom on my camera, but if you're ever in the Pacific Northwest in August, book a whale watching tour because that's when all the orcapods get together to eat all the salmon. It's awesome. I saw 40 orcas in 1 2-hour whale watching tour. It's pretty amazing, but also they were like right near the boat. It was kind of scary too, but definitely one of the most beautiful and powerful animals I've ever seen live in nature. So we got this amazing diversity, just so different from one another. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to tie it to something that's really important to me. That's the concept of physiology. That's the field of biology that I study. We'll talk about what that is in a minute. So in order to have a conversation about animals, we're going to spend 5 weeks talking about animals. It's important to first define what an animal is. And I bet you probably haven't put much thought into this. You've probably never been asked, what is an animal? But imagine at Thanksgiving dinner, your aunt or your uncle or your grandmother said, hey, what is an animal anyway? What would you say? And that's what we're going to spend the next little while talking about. How would you actually explain what an animal is? And so I'm going to pitch this to you. What would you say? What is an animal?
Something that eats.
Something that eats? Good, okay, that's possible, true. You're also going to see that I'm a bit of a devil's advocate here. I'm going to play a little devil's advocate game here where I'm going to challenge you sometimes. Because everything you say, there's probably an exception to, which makes it really frustrating to be a biologist. Okay, so something that eats, I'm having trouble arguing against that, but we'll get back to that. What else? What else would you say? So this is an animal because, in the back corner?
Well, I guess I was thinking more again, is it alive? But I was going to say reproduction.
Okay, so what about reproduction? What is it? That it reproduces generally or in a certain way?
I was going to just say in general, but yeah.
Okay. So think about when we're making this definition. Why is it an animal and not a plant or a fungus or something else? Got lots of hands. Okay, right here.
They're multicellular.
Multicellular. Okay, that's interesting. Good. What else? We got.
Sexual reproduction.
They use sexual reproduction. That's pretty good. So that would tie into the answer back in the back. Yeah, here.
They move around.
They move around. Do all animals move?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As far as I know.
We'll come back to that one in a minute. Yeah.
They depend on other organisms to survive,
How so?
either to eat or to, I don't know, just really.
Definitely need to eat, for sure. Yeah, and obviously in lots of other ways too. Okay. So what I'm hoping you're coming up with right now is this idea that this is not a fun question to answer at all. That sucks. There's lots of reasons that we might use to define what an animal is, and none of them are very good. So what we're going to come up with as a class, I'm going to keep asking you, is I think there's 8 points here. How would you answer that question? And the reason it's hard is because we created this grouping of organisms we call animals. Right? We didn't create the animals themselves, but we said, oh, all of these organisms are animals, and all of these organisms are not animals. So as biologists who created this classification system, we've got to have a way to say, well, those are animals and those are not. So what are those things? So I've already heard lots of great answers, and as I mentioned, a lot of them are great answers, but with exceptions. So what else? Anybody have any other ones yet? They have a skeletal system. Some do, some don't. Okay.
They like cell walls.
They lack cell walls. That's a good one. Right? So sometimes we can define a group as they don't have something. Right? So they're an animal because they don't have a cell wall, might be a good answer. You'll see that one of these points is actually that, yeah.
They have organ systems?
Organ systems, organs just generally, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, good, yeah.
They have sexual, reproduction.
Sexual reproduction, for sure. Plants do too, right? So keep that in mind. So already you've given me about 18 more things than my first lecture. I just went through this with another class. And so bravo, I'm really excited about the interaction here. So that's it. So let's sort of put all of this together and try to come up with our best definition for what an animal is. And like I mentioned, there's no good one. We're gonna come up with the best definition we can. So let's think about the organismal organization. We've got these different kingdoms, and these change from decade to decade. You know, we've got bacteria and protists and plants and fungi and animals here. You learned about plants in the last half of this course, the first half of the course. You learned about protists and fungi in 192 a little bit, right? Hopefully. Very short period of time, but you would have spent a bit of time talking about them. You take micro, you're gonna learn more about bacteria, so we're trying to cover all of the different organismal groups. But again, we've created this organization based on characteristics. Okay? Your dog doesn't wake up and say, hey, I'm in this club over here. They don't care, they're just a dog, right? They don't care about whether or not they're different from a fungus or a protist or something like that. This is something we like to do. We like to categorize things in nice little boxes. So let's start with some of the most basic ones, things that we would have talked about in Gen Bio 1 or maybe even Gen Bio 2. Okay. You got some organisms that are prokaryotes and some that are eukaryotes. You would have learned about this. Major difference here is the fact that the eukaryotes evolved these cellular organelles that are membrane bound. Okay. So hopefully this is mostly review at this point. And we know that that helps us divide out some of the kingdoms from one another. Okay. So, the prokaryotes over there, the bacteria, and then everything else is a eukaryote. So animals are one group of eukaryotes. Mentioned earlier, the idea of being multicellular, right? Some of the organismal groups are unicellular, and some are multicellular. So here's a protozoan that's unicellular, paramecium there, and there's some form of beetle that is multicellular. So maybe we don't even think about ourselves as multicellular, but that's a pretty big, important part of what we are. We're made up of millions and millions of cells, and that makes us pretty different from unicellular organisms. So it's part of our definition. But it doesn't distinguish us from all the groups, but it starts to help us distinguish from some of the groups. The term metazoan means multicellular, and then the zoa part is animal. Now, all animals are multicellular, so they kind of go together, but you could have multicellular groups like plants and fungi too, right? Okay. So metazoan refers to animal. So we've got plants, fungi, and animals as multicellular. We're starting to see some of the characteristics that help us define what animals are. You actually got most of these right off our original discussion, so this makes this a lot easier for me. Okay. Talked about how you get food, right? And you didn't mention plants in the definition because I think it's obvious they do it differently than animals do. Plants are autotrophs. They are able to produce their own food through photosynthesis. How nice would that be to just go outside and bask in the sun and just make your own food? You wouldn't have to forage or hunt or anything like that. But animals, of course, don't have the equipment, essentially, to do that process, right? We're lacking chlorophyll and some other things, so we can't just make our own food through photosynthesis. So we have to acquire our nutrients, our energy from other sources, and of course we do that by eating. Okay? Within the animal kingdom, we have different styles of nutrient application, or sequestration. We've got some animals that are very much carnivorous, they eat other animals. We have animals that are omnivorous, they eat all kinds of things. We've got some that are frugivorous, that eat plants or algae, that type of thing. Okay. So what's this one? I'm gonna ask you all the questions about marine biology here, so, because I'm a marine biologist, so.
Is it a sea urchin?
It's a sea urchin, right, so that's a sea urchin, we'll talk about them. They're like little lawnmowers that scurry around the ocean floor and they graze on algae and plants. Very effective feeders, definitely a herbivore, and there's, I don't know, an alligator or something eating some other animal, so herbivore. Okay, so very different method of acquiring nutrients. Okay? Why doesn't that categorization separate the animals from the fungi? So we see there that fungi are heterotrophs. How do fungi get their nutrients? Anybody remember?
They break down, they can break down like dead animals and dead.
Stuff, right? Stuff in the soil, right? I don't even know what you call it, detritus and decaying stuff in the soil. They can break it down and absorb it. Yeah. They depend on the host. Well, they do have interactions with bacteria in their root system. Is that what you're referring to? Yep. Definitely really complicated symbiosis there with the fungi and their nutrient acquisition. Okay. They are technically heterotrophs just like us, but they do it a little differently. We can clearly say they're not autotrophs because they're not photosynthesizing, but it gets hard to separate these two groups because they do share a lot of common characteristics. But there is one very small but useful way of separating these groups based on how they get their nutrients. It's not a good answer, it's just an answer that seems to work out okay. Okay? So, fungi will digest their food externally, as was mentioned, and then absorb nutrients. Okay, so they're like releasing chemicals into the soil, they're working with their bacterial symbionts to try to break down things in the soil, which they can then absorb into their bodies. So in a way, they're digesting their food before they ingest it. Whereas animals, for the most part, ingest their food first, and then they digest it. Right? So, pretty small difference, but it does help us separate those two groups a little bit. Notice that it says with some exceptions. Anybody know of an exception to this rule for animals? So an animal that first digests its food and then ingests its food?
I know cows do that, or maybe camels.
Did you say cow?
Camels and cows both. Like
Camels, well, they definitely chew up food and then move it around and then, but they're definitely bringing it into their body first for the breakdown.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else? They're definitely different in the way they regurgitate and move things around. Okay, so one of the, oh, yeah.
Spiders?
Spiders, yeah, that's the most common answer. They actually secrete digestive enzymes onto their prey. So they've wrapped it up and killed it, or mostly killed it probably. They start to secrete digestive enzymes into the prey item, sort of liquefy the prey, and then they suck it all back. So they're technically digesting their food first, and then ingesting. So there's always an exception. Definitely still an animal, so they just do things a bit differently. Any other examples where digestion happens first and then ingestion? There's one other group that I can think of that's kind of classically discussed in this way. So starfish do this too. They'll grab their prey item, so maybe they'll grab a mussel or a clam or something, and they'll use their arms to open it up. And they'll open it up just enough so they can essentially invert their stomach and their digestive contents, all these enzymes and things. They kind of just let it come out into their prey item. And then the prey item, which is usually still alive, gets dissolved and digested by those enzymes. And then it's a lot easier to open. And then the starfish just slurps it all back up, including like parts of their digestive system go back into its mouth and inside. So they're technically digesting things before they ingest it. A little bit different style of feeding, but like I said, most of the things we're going to talk about, there's exceptions to the rule. You just have to go with it. Okay? I know as a student, one of the hardest things I had to deal with was there was just so much to know in biology, and I always focused on the exception. Because every time we talk about something, there's gonna be an exception. Try not to do that. It's interesting to think about the exceptions, but try to think about the general patterns we see. Because you'll get caught up in the exceptions, and you'll forget about the patterns, the general patterns. So we have some interesting examples where it's not normal to do this, but the vast majority of animals ingest first, then digest to get their nutrients. Okay. All right, so animals, eukaryotes, multicellular, heterotrophs, that first ingest, then digest their food. Okay. That's number one. Okay, so if you thought this was going to be an easy thing, that's point 1 of 8. Okay, it's very hard to define what an animal is. We're going to come up with our best definition. This is some of the characteristics you can use. Luckily for me, you've already mentioned a lot of the other ones too. Okay. I know that first slide, this just had a bunch of question marks, but as you'll see as we go, slide by slide, we're going to fill in the blanks. Okay. And those are all available to you on YouTube. All right, so what else? What's next? Somebody mentioned they don't have a cell wall. That's actually a pretty good way of differentiating the plants from the animals, right? Remember, plants are multicellular, eukaryotes. They're definitely not heterotrophs, but you can see how it's difficult to separate plants and animals on all different characteristics, but some are easier than others. So cell wall, definitely not found in animals. Movement. This is one of my favorite concepts to think about. It's so obvious that animals can move, right? But do all animals move? So I already posed this question. So what animals don't move?
Sea anemones.
Sea anemones? Okay, that's a good one. They can move their tentacles, but they're not moving around, right? So yeah. Corals, yeah. Anybody else?
Mollusks.
Mollusks? Some mollusks. Yeah, some mollusks are anchored in one place, like a mussel, for example. Some mollusks are very motile, like octopuses. We'll talk about them. Barnacles are animals, and they're definitely cemented to a rock or a whale or a boat or wherever they happen to find themselves. Okay. So we can easily think of a variety of different animals that we would say are not motile. But actually, all animals at some point in their life cycle have a motile phase. Even the ones you mentioned, like a barnacle, has a larval phase that can swim around. Most other organismal groups don't have that capability. Right? So we have this sort of definition of they're capable of moving at some point in their life. And in order to see that point in their life, you may have to really study that organism really well. And so we'll use some of these examples you mentioned through the class, through the rest of the course, to talk about that concept of movement and how it actually is something animals can do, even though it's not always the case for all organisms at all times of their life. One you may not have thought about before or heard of is this idea that all animals have something called Hox genes. These are genes that encode for body plans and body parts. Okay? We've realized, especially since we've figured out what DNA is and how to sequence things, that Hox genes are standard in animals, and they are different from animal group to animal group, and they encode for essentially how the body is put together. So we don't see these genes in other organisms. So here's an example of a couple of very different animals. There's a fly and a human here. You see some color coding there that sort of connect homologous features between the two organisms. Right? So you got like an abdomen and thorax kind of area. You've got like an arms and legs kind of area. You've got like a head area, neck area. These are different like body parts that we have. All animals, their body plans evolved due to mutations in Hox genes. So these animals have these genes that encode for how the animal is designed, essentially. But over evolutionary time, sometimes mutations happen, which change the code. And then they change the body form that you get from that individual. So homeotic genes is the full name for it, or Hox genes. They're involved in designing that overall body plan. Like any gene, they're under pressures for natural selection, and mutations happen. And sometimes those mutations end up being good things, and they end up being selected for. And over evolutionary time, you go from things that maybe look like a worm to something that looks like a human, right? We're talking big changes over long periods of time, and they're all sort of the underpinnings of how that works is related to this family of genes called Hox genes. So I'll give you a very generalized idea of how this might work. We'll come back to this, especially when we talk about going from invertebrates to vertebrates, very different body plans that we evolved in that period. But if you think about what the first sort of ancestral vertebrate was, probably looked something like this, kind of like a fish-like organism, but very basic in its design. Okay, kind of like a worm, maybe one that could swim. You can sort of see a tail and a head end. But you don't see very many features here that are very impressive. And then you think about a fish, definitely a vertebrate, with eyes, it's got paired fins, it's got a jaw, it's got a bunch of characteristics that we know fish have. But we would have went from something like this to something like this over a long period of time, but there was an evolutionary change there. So what we know from genetic sequencing and looking at DNA is that these Hox genes changed in these organisms from sort of these early ancestral forms to the more derived current forms to change the body plan. And the way it kind of worked was that in a lot of cases, the Hox genes were accidentally duplicated. So when cells divide and chromosomes get copied and DNA gets copied, sometimes mistakes happen. And we have many instances through the evolution of animals where you have entire genomes duplicated. So you go from one generation to the next, and all of a sudden there's twice as much DNA as there was before. There's 2 copies of everything. Imagine how complicated that is. But the 2 new copies are the same as the old copy. So they're still doing the same thing. But when you have these duplications, there's a benefit, or potential benefit. What happens is one copy can continue doing what it does, allowing that animal to do all the things it does, create whatever body it has. The other copy is free to mutate, potentially without serious problems. So a lot of times when you have these duplications of genes, the secondary copy will change through just random mutation. And then every once in a while, that changed copy works out to be very, very advantageous to that organism. And not to make a long story short, but imagine you woke up one day and had arms, and yesterday you didn't have arms. That's a pretty big deal, right? So changes can happen on a drastic level from mutations to these Hox genes. Yeah, question.
Is there anything that prevents the first copy from mutating?
Yeah, we have lots of cell checkpoints that try to avoid that. Okay, there's lots of, when you do cell biology, you'll learn a lot about that. Essentially, if things don't divide properly, if there's errors, there's lots of ways that the cell will eliminate that thing, or the cell itself will be killed off, essentially. So we have lots of mechanisms to avoid this, but sometimes it happens. And when you're talking about millions of years of evolution, every once in a while it happens, and then it could become a very important part of the diversification of organisms. Yeah.
Can you repeat why the first copy won't mutate?
Well, the first copy could mutate.
Oh, okay.
Yep, but the idea is that first copy is doing something. It's making whatever gene or protein that it's making, it's important.
Okay.
And so it's still doing its job and everything, but that other copy, imagine if you all of a sudden had a twin, nobody knew, and then that twin can go off and do other things, whatever nefarious things they might do, right? 2 copies, they can do their own thing, okay? It allows for potentially large jumps in evolutionary change. So we see these gene duplication events as being important in a lot of the branch points in these tree of life type relationships that we see. Most of this conversation is very advanced. You'll talk about it in genetics, molecular biology, and other courses. But I just want to introduce it today as like something that's important for defining what an animal is. Those are really great questions, really big concept questions that you're asking. So we have these Hox genes, they're capable of moving. A couple of other ones, you know, not super important, but something that's interesting. We have certain types of materials in our body that other organisms don't have. So we have certain structural proteins and compounds that help create body parts and stuff. So something like collagen is a common thing found in animals. It's not something I would put at the top of the list, but it's definitely something that helps us define what an animal is. We also have nervous tissue and muscle tissue. Okay, so again, most of this we just take for granted. Of course we have muscle and nerves, but those other groups don't have that, right? You're not going to look at your plant and say, wow, it's muscular, or look at all the nervous tissue in there, right? So animals are pretty special because they have a couple of cell types which we now use a lot for a lot of important functions. Again, always exceptions. Okay? There's a couple of groups, especially our earliest animals, that technically don't have nervous tissue or muscle tissue. Okay, so we'll talk about those as we go. Sponges, we'll talk about it. Jellyfish, we'll talk about it. They move, like jellyfish can swim, you can see that. They technically don't have true muscles though. They have cells that can contract, but they're not actually muscle cells. So we do see a few animal groups that technically don't have certain characteristics, but generally speaking, animals have muscle and nervous tissue. This was mentioned by a few people, sexual reproduction. Most animals reproduce sexually. It doesn't mean that other animal groups, other organismal groups don't use sexual reproduction. We spend a lot of time in plant biology there, talking about ways of reproduction. But this is sort of the general way that animals reproduce. And again, this one's got all kinds of holes in it. It's very easy to find examples of animals that don't reproduce sexually or don't always reproduce sexually. So we're going to see lots of asexual reproduction in animals. Okay. Yeah. Essentially, if you can dream up a weird way to reproduce, there's an animal that can do that. So we'll talk about some of those things. Okay. All right, so I have a 4-year-old, so I'm preparing for this whole birds and bees talk and everything. So I'm probably going to bring up this slide and explain it all to them, but I don't think I have to explain it to you. But what I want you to think about is how simple this is compared to the alterations and generations idea you did in the plant section, right? Plants are so complicated as far as reproduction and development and those types of things. But this is an example of the most simple form of reproduction. It's using us as an example. We're pretty straightforward as far as reproduction goes. But like I mentioned before, lots and lots of animals have modes of asexual reproduction. There's even a few animals that almost never reproduce sexually. Talk about that as we go along too. So I don't think I have to get into this. I think you understand, like development of gametes, production of fertilized eggs, and then development into the adult mature form, which can continue that life cycle. The only thing I'll mention here is that this zygote developing little baby producing an adult in some animals is a very straightforward process. Humans, for example, have what we call direct development. Our kids kind of look like adults, right? They're just miniature forms. They have the same number of arms and legs, and all the parts are the same. They just grow. We call that direct development. There are many animals that have what we call indirect development, where they have different larval phases that are very different from the adults. So even though this sexual reproduction idea is simple, some life cycles of animals are very complicated. So just think about like a tadpole turning into a frog. The juvenile looks nothing like the adult. They don't even live in the same place potentially. It's still sexual reproduction, but their developmental strategy can be very different. So we'll talk about that as we go. We're still on point 1, which is, so I think that's enough. Thanksgiving comes along and you're ready for this question. Be like, Grandma, this is gonna take a while. Animals are multicellular, they are heterotrophs, they are eukaryotes, they have the capacity to ingest and digest their meals, they lack cell walls, they're usually capable of moving, they have collagen, they have nervous tissue, they have muscle tissue, they mostly reproduce sexually, they have OX genes. There's our terrible definition of what an animal is, but that's the best we can do. Good question.
Can I tell the first, like, there was a
I know, there's a mistake.
Oh.
That was to see who was paying attention, so, yeah, this is complete. I don't remember why that appears there, but honestly, every year somebody mentions that and I keep forgetting to update it, but, yeah. Okay. So this is the best we can do. And I wanna bring it back to this idea that animals didn't self-segregate into their own group. They just evolved to be who they are. Humans decided to categorize all these different organisms into their own groups. So we have to be able to make an argument for why one organism is in one group and one organism is in another. We created these bins, we put these organisms in, we have to be able to explain why. And so when you create an artificial bin like that, you're now tasked with the challenge of explaining it. And so that's what we're stuck with. So welcome to being a biologist. This is sort of what we have. Lots of animals to make sense of. This is step 1 of that process. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, I'm gonna go on to the next lecture. Some of these are shorter than others. We're gonna take this idea and we're gonna expand it. Big time. Okay, so here's our planet. Amazing place. There's something like 1.4 million species of animals. And if you go on Wikipedia and you Google how many animals are there, if you did ask this question today and tomorrow, you'd probably get a different answer because every day we're discovering new species. There's probably more extinct species than there are extant species. So extinct species are ones that are no longer, right? They've gone extinct. Extant would be the ones that are currently found on the planet. So there's a lot. But no one really believes that what we've identified is all of them, right? Of course not. We haven't even started to explore half of the places on this marble to try to find out what animals are there. Most of them are so small you wouldn't even see them, right? You need special technology to even look for some of the animals we're talking about. So if you ask any biologist, how many animals do you think there are? They'd be like, I don't know, 10 million, 20 million, I don't know, there's a lot. Way more than what we have already identified. We have 5 weeks to cover animal diversity. So my job here is to explain to you at least 1 million species over 5 weeks. Okay, so we're gonna try to do this in a more calm way, but imagine how challenging that is to learn. You've only got 5 weeks of animal diversity. There's a lot of information that's gonna come along with that. So let's start with the most important question. Why are there so many? Why isn't there just 1 or 2 or 5 species on the planet? Why is there millions of species of animals? How would you explain that? Yeah, so they have to live in different environments. You want to expand a little bit? Exactly. So if you couldn't hear that, animals live in different environments, and just because you're good at living in one place doesn't mean you're good at living somewhere else. And that's really the idea. Our world is full of ridiculously different environments. Cold and hot and dry and wet, aquatic, terrestrial, high altitude mountains, deep sea, all of those environments, incredibly different in the characteristics that they have. What are the chances that any animal would have evolved to be successful in all of those places? There's only one, and that's because we cheat, right? We create technology that lets us live in different places. but we can't even live in all of them, okay? But all of these places are very different. And so of course, natural selection acts to diversify and speciate all the different organisms into specialty sort of situations that are best adapted to their environment. Okay? So, why are there so many animal species? Because there's so many environments. Exactly right. So if we go back to Gen Bio 2, 192, talk about ecology and evolution, we talked about this guy, some of the important concepts that Darwin came up with. You know, it's very obvious that organisms just in general, but animals we're going to talk about in this class, are well adapted to live in their local environment. Okay? It's a very important biological concept. Because of the selection of traits that allow them to be successful. So an animal that's living in a cold environment has been selected for because of certain traits. Maybe it has a nice warm fur coat, or maybe it can produce its own heat. And that's very different from the traits that might be selected for from a tropical animal that lives in a warm and hot place. So you add up enough of these environments, and you think about all of the challenges of survival and being successful, and you end up with many, many, many different species of animals. What I hope to convey to you a little bit in this course is this concept that where an animal lives, sorry, I should say where an animal can live, is very much dependent on what I'll call physiological adaptations. It's not the end of everything, it's a start. Okay, so before I go back to this, what is physiology? So I'm a physiologist, Dr. Dean's a physiologist. What's a physiology? What's the concept of physiology, the field of physiology? Anybody know? Yeah.
The inner processes of how the body works.
The processes of how the body works, exactly, that's perfect, okay? And you can be thinking about that with the body of any organism. It could be a unicellular organism, I don't know if we call that a body, but it's their cell. Or it could be a much more complicated animal or plant or fungus. They all have a physiology to them. How does their body work? How does it do the things it needs to do? And so the idea that an animal can live in places where their physiology allows is kind of the basic starting point. Why can't you live underwater? Give me one reason. You, not anybody else, but why can't you live underwater? Don't have gills, you can't breathe, right? So what? We don't have the physiological tool to do that, right? Lots of examples like that. Really basic idea. Okay? So physiology, as far as animals go, is the study of how, just generally speaking, an animal works. This is Knut Schmidt-Nielsen. I love his name. He was one of the most important early physiologists, mainly because he put everything together into a textbook. You notice there's an elephant on here? Textbook was called How Animals Work. Basic as it gets. How does it work? So think about what you're doing right now. You're working really hard. Half the things you're doing you don't even notice or don't even think about. You're breathing, your heart's beating, you're circulating your blood, you're releasing hormones to different parts of your body. You're maybe digesting the last meal you had. You might be building some new things, some new cells, repairing some old cells. Your immune system might be fighting something. Okay? Hopefully you're listening or watching the lecture. Maybe you're taking notes, you're moving. All of those things. Luckily, we don't have to think about half of them because they're just happening in the background. But you're doing a lot of things. That's physiology. The study of how does all that work. So I'm a physiologist, I like to think about those kinds of things. How you work, how your body evolved to work, kind of dictates where you can live. Now again, humans are definitely not the best example for this, but think about any other animal. How their body works, what they can and can't do, dictates where they can and can't live. Now like I said, that's just the starting point. It doesn't mean that's it. Just because you can live somewhere, doesn't mean you do live somewhere. Because you might be able to live somewhere, but something bigger than you might eat you, and therefore you don't live there anymore. Okay, so there's concepts of competition and other things that are going to influence where animals are distributed on the planet. So then we get together the concepts of physiology and ecology and all of that type of thing, and we have a very complicated field of biology. So physiology can be thought of in many different levels of specificity or organization. Here's a definition I like that kind of encompasses everything. So bear with me for a moment. It's a long definition. So physiology is the molecular and protein interactions. So we're talking about things very small inside cells, or maybe just inside the body at least, very small things that are interacting, and they're responsible for essentially how your cells work. And then your cells, doing different processes, work together with other similar cells to allow tissues to have certain functions. And then tissues work together with other tissues to create organs, which have certain functions. And then organs work with other organs to create organ systems, which create and do certain functions. And then organ systems get together in the entire organism to do certain things that allow the whole animal or individual to do what they do. It's a multi-level, complex system of all the way down from the subcellular level to very much to the whole organism, all these things in between that are working, and it's complicated. A little easier way to envision this is with this image. This is pretty much in every general biology textbook, and I love it. It's one of the most important concepts to tie together as a biologist. Biological levels of organization. Very simple, right? Kind of think about the cell as the basic building block of life, right? So some organisms could be just a cell, unicellular organism. Everything they need to do what they do is found in that cell. But then we have multicellular organisms like us, which take it to that next level of complexity. Those cells interact with each other, form tissues, they interact with each other to form organs, form organ systems, organisms, and so on and so forth. So I would argue that physiology, how stuff works, starts at the level of at least the molecule and goes up to at least the entire organism. Because some physiological functions are full organismal level, right? Other ones might be very specific to a certain cell type in a certain situation. You can even argue that physiology is included in this population level. Right now you're secreting and releasing different pheromones that may be attracting someone nearby or repelling someone nearby. Maybe you're making them feel good about themselves, or maybe you're making them feel bad about themselves. You are interacting with each other extra-organismally, I guess you would say. Okay? I almost said orgasmally, but that's a wholly different situation. You have an interaction with your coworkers, your colleagues, your other members of your population that is still physiological. And that will, of course, lead to things like reproduction and other things. So physiology really covers a very large level or broad expanse of this levels of organization. And I would argue to be a good biologist, you need to try to understand things at many levels. So maybe you're interested in ecology and conservation or evolution. You may be thinking about things in a more larger level, maybe populations of organisms or communities of organisms. You still have to know a little bit about their physiology. Who eats what? Why do they need those nutrients? How do they hunt for that organism without understanding their muscles and how they work? There's lots of reasons to understand physiology. So as we go through this course, we're going to talk about diversity of animals, but I'm going to tie in physiological evolution to that conversation. Okay. We're going to talk about, oh, now we have lungs, now we have gills, now we have different body parts that weren't there before. This allows for certain things to happen that other organisms can't do. So we'll try to sort of tie that into the overall conversation as we go. So we've got a lot of animals. Coming back to that same question, original question of what is an animal? Now we've got the challenge of, well, now we have so many animals, how do we differentiate those and explain the different animal groups? So what animal group do we belong to? Yeah, we're mammals, right? We'll have one lecture on mammals, the last lecture of the quarter. Okay. Who has a pet that's not a mammal? Anybody? Or who knows someone who has a pet that isn't a mammal? Yeah, what is it? A snake. So what group is that? Reptiles, right? So we're gonna have a lecture on reptiles. What's another one? Fish. We'll have actually several lectures on fish. Anybody else?
Rodents.
Rodents, those are mammals, so they would be in our group. Yeah. But definitely a fan favorite for some people, yeah. Turtle, yeah, so there's a reptile.
Birds.
Birds, also a reptile. We'll talk about that. There's a lot of controversy about that one.
Frogs.
Frogs, what group's the frogs in? Amphibians. Isn't it interesting that every group you mentioned was a vertebrate? That's this many of the animals. Of that 1.4 million, it's like this many. Almost all of those 1.4 million animals are not vertebrates. So we're gonna spend actually most of the rest of the quarter talking about invertebrates, and then at the end we'll get to vertebrates. Okay? You're gonna have lots of time in your default career to talk about human biology and human concepts. This is pretty much our only chance to teach you about other animal groups. So bear with me, there's important things to learn about other groups that will help you understand yourselves a lot better too, and especially our health. We'll get into that as we go. How do we actually make sense of them all? We've only got a couple minutes left. I'm gonna introduce you to a couple concepts. This is what we're gonna go into in lab next week. When we look at all those different animals and try to make sense of them, your dog versus your fish versus your turtle, whatever it is, your snake, whatever it is you're trying to categorize, we come up with ways to put them in bins again. It's our human nature to do this. We'll use things like body plans to try to separate them. Well, these animals have 4 legs, and these animals have no legs, so they must be different. Okay? Sometimes it's very obvious like that, sometimes it's a little bit more complicated. So we're gonna use body plans as a way of differentiating between different animals. We're gonna look at some developmental biology characteristics that we can use to actually separate different animal groups from one another. Usually this is something you have to look at with a little bit more specificity as development goes. So we're talking about maybe the first few cell divisions of life kind of level of specificity. We'll look at different tissues that are present in different animals, and some animals have more than others. We'll talk about how that through development can help us differentiate different animal groups. We'll also always have our way of falling back on molecular information. So keep in mind, almost everything we know about biology was figured out before we even knew what DNA was. And then DNA was like this magic cheat code to say, oh, well, how are these animals actually interrelated? And so we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. And what we're going to talk about in lab next week, I'll start the conversation. We're going to start with body plans. This is the most basic way of, it's really the essence of being a scientist or biologist. You look at something and you make a judgment. You're like, well, this one, its body has no real form or structure to it. This is something we would call asymmetrical. Anyone know what this is?
Sponge.
Sponge, yeah, okay, good. It's actually the word. No one in the last class got that, which is interesting. This is a sponge. Is a sponge an animal? Yes. So first animal group we're going to talk about next class. Most sponges kind of have like just random body forms. They're just like that. And so you can't really say there's any given pattern. So we call that asymmetrical. But most animals have some form of symmetry to their body. I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there. So I'm going to skip ahead here. Talk about how some animals you can cut in half certain ways and other animals different ways. We'll get back to this concept on Monday, and then you'll see it in lab.
Very ready for this part of the lecture.
I also wanted to let you know that I have a lecture, this exact same lecture from 11:20 to 12:20, so I'm usually here from 12:20 to 1. If you have any questions.
Dude, man.
Have a great weekend. See you on Monday.